Meghan left humiliated as Harry finally tells the whole truth about their life together, and the silence that once protected the fairy tale is now cracking loud enough for the whole world to hear.
In the States, it's multiple publications that's reporting it.
Behind the manicured lawns and filtered family portraits, something had been rotting for a long time, and the smell of it was finally seeping through the palace-grade polish. This wasn't just another tabloid tantrum or social media pile-on. This was the kind of revelation that doesn't just bruise reputations, it rewrites legacies. And at the center of it all stood Harry, no longer the smiling prince in exile, but a man pacing through the wreckage of secrets he helped build. Sources say the pressure had been building for months, maybe years. Late nights, closed-door arguments, legal calls that stretched past midnight. Meghan, always composed in public, reportedly turned sharp and restless in private, sensing control slipping through her fingers like sand. Because this time, the whispers weren't staying whispers. This time, someone else was preparing to speak. Her name? Dill. Not a blogger, not a troll, not a faceless rumor account. A real woman, with documents, timelines, and a story that, if even partially verified, could detonate the carefully curated narrative of Harry and Meghan's perfect family life. According to insiders, DL had stayed silent for years under layers of legal agreements and quiet pressure. But silence, especially the forced kind, has an expiration date. And when she began signaling she was ready to step forward, Harry reportedly spiraled. Not with rage, with dread. Because he knew what parts of her story overlapped with his own buried guilt. The core of the storm? Explosive claims about the births of the children the world had celebrated through staged photos, glowing interviews, and tightly controlled announcements. DL allegedly asserted she had a direct biological and medical role that was erased from the public narrative. Clinic records, travel logs, communications. She wasn't shouting, she was organizing. Friends say the moment Harry realized she might actually go public, something in him broke. He had always justified the secrecy as protection. Protection from the press, protection from scrutiny, protection for the family. But now that shield looked less like love and more like a wall built to keep one woman invisible. And Meghan? Insiders describe a different reaction. Not grief, not reflection, panic, strategy meetings, legal positioning, calls to advisors who specialize in reputation containment. Because image, once cracked, doesn't just chip, it shatters. What made this different from every other scandal swirling around them was one brutal detail. Harry was no longer willing to deny everything on autopilot. In a recent private conversation that later leaked through multiple sources, he allegedly admitted there were parts of the story the public doesn't know and that not everyone was treated fairly. Not a confession, but not a denial either, and that gray space was gasoline on a fire. People close to Meghan say she felt blindsided. Humiliated, not just by DL's claims, but by Harry's shifting stance. For years, they had moved as a unit, presenting a united front against critics, institutions, and headlines. Now he was wavering, and in high-stakes image wars, hesitation looks like betrayal. Dill, meanwhile, kept moving like someone who had waited a long time for this exact moment. Her alleged documentation wasn't theatrical. It was procedural. Dates lined up, appointments cross-referenced, communications preserved. Legal experts who quietly reviewed some of the material reportedly described it as serious enough to warrant formal examination. Careful words, but heavy ones. Harry's inner circle says he began rereading old messages, revisiting decisions made under stress, influence, and fear. He wasn't just worried about public backlash. He was wrestling with the possibility that in trying to protect one version of his family, he had deeply hurt someone who had once trusted him completely. The emotional fallout inside their home was reportedly intense. Raised voices, long silences, separate rooms. Meghan, used to commanding a narrative, now faced a storyline she couldn't fully script. And the cruel twist? The humiliation wasn't coming from strangers online. It was coming from the slow realization that the man beside her might not keep the secret fortress standing. When Harry finally indicated, quietly behind closed doors, that he might acknowledge DL's existence if things escalated legally, Meghan's world reportedly tilted. Because acknowledgement is validation, and validation would mean the fairy tale had fine print the public was never shown. Observers say this is no longer just about reputation, it's about accountability, about who gets credit, who gets erased, and who gets to decide which truths are too complicated for the public. Deal claims she was written out of history. Harry is now confronting whether he helped hold the pen. And as the possibility of formal disclosures looms, the couple who once left the royal machine to escape secrecy now find themselves trapped in one of their own. The irony is brutal. The optics are disastrous, and the emotional cost? Still unfolding, because once the truth, or even a credible challenge to the official story, enters the room, it doesn't leave quietly. It sits at the table. It demands to be named. And right now, Harry looks like a man who knows that pretending not to see it is no longer an option, while Meghan faces the reality that the image she fought so hard to control may never fully recover. The morning after the emotional standoff felt less like a new day and more like the aftershock of an earthquake that hadn't finished shaking. Inside the Montecito mansion, the air was reportedly so tense you could almost hear it humming. Staff moved quietly. Phones buzzed non-stop, and Harry, according to people close to him, looked like a man who had finally accepted that the story he helped protect was now bigger than his ability to contain it. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't lashing out. That almost made it worse. The frantic energy had drained out of him, replaced by a heavy, resigned calm that scared those around him. Because this wasn't panic anymore, it was acceptance. Acceptance that DL's claims weren't just internet noise. They were organized, persistent, and headed toward public and possibly legal scrutiny. Meghan, on the other hand, was said to be in full crisis mode, not emotional collapse, calculated urgency. Calls with legal advisors, strategy sessions with reputation experts, long conversations behind closed doors where phrases like containment, liability, and narrative control floated through the halls. She had built her public image with precision, brick by brick, interview by interview, and now a woman she had never publicly acknowledged was threatening to pull at the foundation. What reportedly stung the most wasn't just DL stepping forward, it was Harry no longer promising absolute silence. Insiders claim Meghan repeatedly asked him to hold the line, to deny, deflect, and delay like they had done in past storms. But Harry, worn down and emotionally cornered, allegedly responded with something that changed everything. "I can't pretend she doesn't exist." That sentence, if true, was the crack that split the partnership dynamic wide open, because for years, their strength had been unity against the world. Critics, together. Press, together. Institutions, together. Now the threat was internal. A truth, or at least a version of it, that Harry felt morally pulled to acknowledge and Meghan felt strategically forced to suppress. DL, meanwhile, remained almost eerily steady in comparison. While headlines speculated and social media spiraled, she reportedly stayed focused on process, verification, legal channels, documentation. People who spoke with her described her tone as firm but not theatrical. She wasn't chasing viral fame. She was pushing for recognition of her alleged role and what she says was years of erasure. Legal commentators watching from the sidelines began using careful but loaded language, if substantiated, if verified, if documentation aligns. Those ifs carried weight. Because if even part of DL's account held up under scrutiny, the issue wouldn't just be personal embarrassment, it would raise serious questions about transparency, ethics, and who gets written into or out of powerful family narratives. Harry reportedly started preparing for the possibility that he would have to speak more openly. Not a tell-all spectacle, something measured, controlled, but honest enough to avoid directly contradicting evidence if it surfaced. Friends say he practiced phrases out loud, wrestling with how to balance truth, privacy, and protection for the children at the center of it all. And that's where the emotional conflict hit hardest, because whatever the adults did or didn't do, the kids were innocent. Harry allegedly repeated that constantly they didn't choose any of this. That fear of their lives becoming a legal and media battlefield is said to be what pushed him closer to disclosure rather than denial. He believed a partial, careful truth now might prevent a far uglier explosion later. Meghan, however, was described as seeing it differently. To her, insiders claim, acknowledgement didn't reduce chaos, it invited it. Once you confirm one hidden piece, the world starts digging for 10 more. She reportedly warned Harry that opening the store would mean years of scrutiny, invasive questions, and permanent damage to the brand they had built around resilience, independence, and a tightly controlled family image. The emotional distance between them allegedly grew by the day. Not dramatic screaming matches every hour, something colder. Strategic disagreements, short conversations, separate advisors, separate phone calls, two people standing in the same storm but calculating survival in completely different ways. Outside their walls, the public conversation grew louder. Some people dismissed Dell outright. Others demanded investigation. Still others focused less on biology and more on the ethics of erasing someone from a life story if her claims were true. The debate wasn't neat or polite. It was messy, emotional, and global. Harry, watching it all unfold, reportedly felt the weight of every past decision. He had left one institution partly because of secrecy and control, only to find himself entangled in a private version of the same thing. That irony wasn't lost on him. Friends say he confided that he felt like he had become part of the machine he once blamed for his pain. By the time discussions of possible formal statements began circulating among insiders, one thing was clear: this was no longer just a gossip cycle. It was a reckoning about truth, power, and who gets to define reality when image and history collide. DL wanted recognition. Meghan wanted control. Harry was stuck between guilt and protection, trying to figure out whether telling the truth would break his family or be the only thing that might eventually save what was left of it. And as the pressure built toward whatever comes next, legal reviews, public words, or continued silence, one brutal fact hovered over everything. Once a hidden voice steps into the light with receipts, the story never goes back to the way it was before. The fairy tale doesn't just fade, it gets questioned, footnoted, and rewritten in real time.